Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 460. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Glad you're back on the show this week. I'm last week you were at YALFest, I believe. So,
Yeah,
hopefully got to meet some fans of the Institute and the show out there. And,
absolutely.
I don't know if we have any more events on our calendar, but certainly as we continue to do events, we will let people know. Also, want to mention to everybody that, a part of what the Libertarian Institute does, as well as publishing books, writing articles, putting out this show, Scott Horton show, and a whole bunch of other great stuff, is we do go to round to different events. And right now we are holding a fundraiser. So help us get out to different events and to continue to put all the great work we put together, and head on over and make a donation at the Institute. If you go to the Institute today, Connor, people will see this article that I just wrote at the top of the featured articles section, and I figure probably be a good place to start our show today. I titled it "Fight Russia to the Last Ukrainian is Official White House Policy." And so, for regular listeners of this show, Connor, they will not be surprised that I am saying this, because I have been saying this on the show for probably the past, I don't know, 6 months or so. I mean, I've been using the phrase since the very beginning, but of course, it's such a dark thing to talk about. I really wasn't sure that this was White House policy, but I think as the war has developed, it's become pretty clearly what the Biden administration is trying to do, which is simply to extend the war in Ukraine as long as possible, give Kiev enough weapons as required to keep the Ukrainian soldiers fighting Russia, while at the same time not going too far as to provoke a direct war with Russia. And so one of the things that has really now been established is that there's a real paradox here for the Biden administration. So they, they say they'll give Kiev all the arms they need to achieve their war aims, which includes retaking the Crimean Peninsula. Russia says that they will use their entire arsenal to defend the Crimean Peninsula, which would include nuclear weapons and direct war with the West, something the Biden administration says they want to avoid. And so the Biden administration really needs to decide if they want to avoid a direct war with Russia, or they want to try to help Ukraine retake the Crimean Peninsula. And the only reason, Connor, you would say that you want to help Ukraine retake the Crimean Peninsula, but at the same time not give Kiev the arms they need to retake the Crimean Peninsula, is if you just want to kind of dangle it as the carrot out there. When it came to government spending, Peter Schiff used to use this really great example of, the economy was hooked on heroin, right? And that's like the form of cheap money. And if you take the heroin away, it's going to need to go through withdrawals. And so this is kind of the situation here, where the Ukrainian government is addicted to American weapons, and the U.S. government just needs to keep them drugged up and delusional enough to keep them fighting. But at the same time, Washington really knows that they could never really help Kiev achieve their war ends. And so I recommend everybody go and check out this article, especially with the latest counteroffensive. The Ukrainian casualty count is just getting so high. I mean, I'm sure we're well over 100,000 Ukrainian deaths at this point. They're sending 150,000 young men to the front lines, into this meat grinder, these fortified Russian lines, where the West knows that Ukraine doesn't have the weapons they need to retake the territory the West wants them to retake. But nonetheless, they are making sure that Kiev continues to fight anyways. So, again, please check out this article. It's not that often that I write op-eds. Most of what I write are news pieces, and I think I put together a pretty good one here, and break down a lot of what's been going on in the war, how the Washington policy has developed, and how really this war is all about making sure that Ukraine fights Russia, to weaken Russia. And I think a lot of that has to do with wanting to strip away a potential ally from China. But, really, an end goal is to weaken Russia, and they are willing to fight Russia, essentially to the last Ukrainian to do it. I mean, at this point, Michael Vallejos has a great article out kind of talking about how the Ukrainian population has dwindled. Millions of Ukrainians, I guess, now see themselves more or less as citizens of Russia. They live in the annexed territories, and I think because either the racist policies of the Zelensky administration towards the Russian people, the language laws, the renaming of everything, the support for the Azov Battalion and other neo-Nazi groups, or just because, this war has been going on for a long time, the Ukrainian forces as well as the Russian forces have committed a lot of war crimes, but I'm sure the Ukrainian people who lived in Ukraine who are victims of Ukrainian war crimes may feel more comfortable in the future living in Russia. And so, we're talking about millions of Ukrainians being peeled away for that reason. 6 million or more refugees fleeing the country. Zelensky's general mobilization created a massive amount of corruption, and a lot of young men bought their way out of the country. Likely, Connor, they're going to be considered criminals, so who knows if they'll ever be able to return. And then with the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have either died or been seriously maimed by this war, I mean, you're talking about really civilization changing levels of people who have been killed so far in this conflict. And it's a truly terrible thing. And Washington could change it all by deciding this war is over, but they haven't done that, and it doesn't look like that's on the horizon. All right, Connor, time to get into some news about the war in Ukraine. The first thing I have here, NATO officials suggest Ukraine could cede territory to Russia to join the alliance. And this was Strand Jensen and Chief Staff for NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg. And it was reported by the Norwegian newspaper VG. And he said, I think that a solution could be for Ukraine to give up territory and get NATO membership in return, adding that it should be up to Ukraine when and on what terms to negotiate. And so, again, Connor, they keep saying it's up to Ukraine when Ukraine wants to negotiate. Well, Ukraine says they want to become a member of NATO, and NATO says they want them to become a member, but at the same time, they're not going to let Ukraine to NATO anytime soon. And so Ukraine really was upset about these comments, and so they've already been walked back at this by Dave DeCamp on August 16th. NATO officials calls comments on calling for Ukraine to cede territory a mistake. A NATO official who sparked backlash from Kiev for suggesting Ukraine could cede territory to Russia in exchange for NATO membership appeared to walk back his comments. My statement about this was a part of a larger discussion about possible future scenarios in Ukraine, and I shouldn't have said that it was that way. It was my mistake. And so, Connor, this cracks me up, because if this is true, that, he was just saying that this is one way the war could end. The idea that merely suggesting the war could end in a negotiated settlement with some territory exchanges, if that's so offensive, we still can't talk about it. We are a very, very long way from ending this war. And so I think that that's really interesting. This whole situation was just really wild. Not just the fact that after all this time, we finally have NATO saying, oh, Ukraine could cede some territory and get NATO membership. And I mean, early in the war, Connor, we had deals on the table for Kiev where Russia was going to go back to the pre-invasion lines and just wanted recognition of the territory they held, autonomy for the Donbass, and independence for Ukraine. And now my guess is when they're talking about Ukraine ceding territory, they're talking about at least the 20% that Russia holds, if not, the full Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donbass, and Kherson regions, which would probably, be quite another significant chunk of Ukrainian territory. All right. Secretary of State Antony Blinken urges Congress to approve new Ukraine spending right away. So this is one thing that I really hate about American politics, and this has gotten worse over the past, during the Obama administration, during the Trump administration, and into the Biden administration. And that is, they wait until the last minute to do anything. And then they freak out and they say, oh, we can't have a debate about this because it needs to be passed right away. So they've known for several months that they were going to run out of aid to send to Ukraine. The White House wasn't sitting there thinking that, oh boy, this aid package may actually get us to the end of this conflict or even to the end of the year. I mean, the summer was predicted for quite some time when they were going to run out of aid. They even had to come up with an accounting error little trick in the Pentagon to get another $6.2 billion in aid. And yet they drug it out and waited for this $24 billion package. And now they're saying, oh, we have to pass it right away. We need this right away. It's really important. And I think a lot of that is because they don't want a special inspector general for this aid. And I imagine that's because they would find just a huge amount of corruption that would put the Afghan war to shame, and lost weapons or not knowing what weapons were sent, broken weapons being sent, just all kinds of accounting scams and corruption where everybody's pocketing money along the line, and just so much horrible things happening behind the scenes that they're in a kind of a complicated place where they have to keep asking Congress for more aid, but at the same time they really can't have any debate about it because I don't think there's a lot of American people who sit around saying there's, a special inspector general for this aid, $137 billion. Well, that wouldn't be needed at all. I mean, this is a larger budget than I would guess almost all cabinet level departments, except maybe like Health and Human Services. I assume they do the, Social Security stuff, and then the Pentagon. And so to not have somebody assigned to track this money is deeply disturbing, and the White House is doing everything they can to make sure that that doesn't develop. All right, Ukraine now says it has no hopes to use F-16s this year. And, I think this has been the case for a while, but this is just, further confirmation of that. Last week I had, wrote a news story up citing the Washington Post, which said they talked to Ukrainian officials who said that the F-16s now aren't going to get there till next summer. If you remember, initially, Ukraine was hoping to get them in September. So now the date has really been backed up. All right, Connor, one more article on Ukraine here before I hand it over to you. Germany considering limiting range of missiles before transfer to Kiev. And these are the fairly advanced Taurus missiles. These have a range of, I think, 300 miles. And really importantly, they could fly at low altitudes to avoid attention by radar and missile defense systems. And my understanding is Russia's missile defenses, particularly their electronic warfare programs, are pretty substantial and advanced. And so I guess that's why Ukraine is hoping for these. I think these missiles would be seen as very effective in carrying out kinds of assassination strikes and things like that. So, not surprised that Ukraine wants them, because Ukraine wants every kind of weapons platform, that they could get their hands on. Germany has been more reserved about sending weapons to Ukraine, so Berlin has been putting off sending these weapons for some time, and now it appears Olaf Scholz may approve it, but only after the manufacturer removes some key components and limits the range of the cruise missile. So we'll see what the range gets limited to here, Connor, and that will probably pretty heavily influence how effective these missiles are on the battlefield. But I know we have some other developments here coming from Germany dealing with the war in Ukraine and, military spending targets. So hand it over to you to let us know what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a piece I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, published today. Berlin walks back legal commitment to meet NATO military spending targets. So Berlin has backed off its plan to legally commit itself to meeting NATO's 2% yearly military spending target, a government source told Reuters on Wednesday. Finance Minister Christian Linder's draft of a new budget financing law was passed by Parliament after, at the last minute, a clause pledging to meet the new target was deleted. And instead, in keeping with Berlin's national security strategy, it will maintain its policy to aim for spending 2% of GDP on military spending on an average over a 5-year period. So, just some of the politics. Germany's foreign ministry, led by Annalena Baerbock, opposed the plan, favored by the defense ministry, of course, to commit to this 2% spending every year. Now, of course, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, came out and said, from now on, we will invest more than 2% of the GDP into our defense year after year. And this got all the NATO hawks and the American military-industrial complex very excited. And they wanted to see more of this from all of our all the other members of the alliance, of course. And so there's just been a huge windfall for the arms industry, this war. And but now this, of course, he made this announcement after the war started. It's now turned in very quickly, as Kyle was explaining and lays out in a very in-depth fashion in his article how it morphed into this proxy war led by the Washington led by NATO to weaken Russia, as Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has said. Now, as a result of the recently taken steps which severely damage relations between Germany and the Kremlin, namely greenlighting the export of Poland's Soviet-era warplanes, which originally came from German military stocks. Additionally, yielding to pressure from Washington and elsewhere inside NATO, Scholz approved the transfer of German-made main battle tanks to Kiev and sent its own tanks as well, vastly escalating the tensions with Russia. Earlier in the war, Scholz had explicitly ruled out just such steps over concerns that sending heavy weapons, including tanks and planes, to Ukraine would lead to a direct war between the North Atlantic Alliance and Russia. Now, in May, Berlin announced it was providing Kiev with a massive arms package worth nearly $3 billion, including 30 more Leopard 1 tanks, as well as Marder fighting vehicles. And this was Germany's largest transfer of weapons since the war began. And NATO members have been increasing their defense spending since Russia's invasion, as I said, which has been just a massive boon for weapons makers, particularly in the U.S. and the U.K. According to Reuters, half of a $103 billion special fund Berlin has set up to modernize the German military will be spent purchasing arms made by the U.S. military-industrial complex. And so, speaking of these profits, this next story I wrote on August 2nd, and this is about BAE Systems, which is the leading in the UK. And so this piece is called British Arms Industry Giant Reaps Huge Windfall Amid West Tensions with Russia and China. So amid the surge in NATO members' military spending as a result of the war in Ukraine, BAE Systems announced that during the first half of the year, its net profit soared with a 57% increase. The British arms industry giant reported its huge windfall on Wednesday. This was a couple weeks ago. BAE Systems stated its revenue swelled to £11 billion, an increase of 13%, while profits after taxes increased to £965 million, about $1.2 billion, during the first 6 months of 2023. This is compared with £615 million in the same period last year. So Chief Executive Charles Woodburn declared, quote, "Our global footprint and leading technologies enable us to effectively support the national security requirements and multi-domain ambitions of our government customers in an increasingly uncertain world." In a separate video that accompanies the company's earnings statement, he acknowledges that the profits are directly related to global destabilization in Western foreign policies, particularly those of London and Washington aimed at Russia and China. Woodburn says, "I'm particularly proud of our support to Ukraine. We've delivered an excellent set of results." And so I point out that in November of last year, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, was already saying that Ukrainian forces had already suffered over 100,000 casualties, killed or wounded, and along with thousands more civilians killed. Now, Woodburn's euphoria regarding the, quote, excellent results notwithstanding, Ukraine has lost approximately 20% of its territory since the Russian invasion began last February. And moreover, Kiev's long-awaited counteroffensive has seen massive losses in military equipment and armor, as well as personnel, no doubt, with no significant gains This month, the Wall Street Journal reported when Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev did not have all the training and weapons from shells and warplanes that it needed to dislodge Russian forces, but they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. They haven't. Deep and deadly minefields, extensive fortifications, and Russian air power have combined to largely block significant advances by Ukrainian troops. Instead, the campaign risks descending into a stalemate with the potential to burn through lives and equipment. Not exactly an excellent set of results. The video continues with Woodburn boasting of further profits, which will be reaped as a result of BAE's role in the major buildup in the Asia Pacific targeting Beijing. He said in the video, "We've secured significant orders for combat vehicles and the selection of the UK's design for AUKUS." Now, AUKUS, of course, is the trilateral military pact formed in 2021 between Washington, London, and Canberra, which will see Australia acquiring nuclear-powered attack submarines, which will be used to patrol waters near China's shores. The three countries are currently carrying out, or at least at the time I wrote this, the drills are done now, but they were carrying out the largest iteration of the U.S.-Australia Talisman Sabre war games, again eyeing Beijing. Now, AUKUS will seriously undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty as these submarines run on 90% or more enriched uranium weapons grade levels. So the most profitable policies for the arms industry are often the most destructive for civilians. Such was the case in Saudi Arabia's genocidal war against the Yemeni people, strongly supported by Washington and London. According to the UN, at least 377,000 people have been killed in the war in Yemen, including mostly children and infants, as a result of the full blockade imposed by Riyadh on northern Yemen and its devastating bombing campaign against civilian infrastructure. With that in mind, in 2020, The Guardian reported Britain's leading arms manufacturer, BAE Systems, sold 15 billion pounds worth of arms and services to the Saudi military during the last 5 years, the period covered by Riyadh's involvement in the deadly bombing campaign in the war in Yemen. By the following year, BAE sales to Riyadh had increased by 2.5 billion pounds. According to the Defense Post, subsequent to the company's announcement earlier this month, shares in BAE rallied 4.5% in early London trading. Andy Chambers, a director at the research group Edison, affirmed leading defense contractor BAE Systems posted a very strong set of results, benefiting from a general rearmament among NATO countries as the war in Ukraine grinds on. And, of course, it's important to note that in January, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists admonished that the risk of nuclear annihilation has never been higher. So we see that, of course, the worse things get, the better it is for the arms industry, and they have so much control over our government and our foreign policy. And so when we're all imperiled with and all terrified of the potentiality of nuclear war, it just means more money for them. Okay, so this next piece, we're moving to the Middle East. This is something I wrote for the Institute. Piece of word. Normalization with Israel is losing popularity in Arab states as Netanyahu kills more Palestinians. So tensions between the Gulf states and Israel are growing as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu oversees illegal settlement expansion, killings of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And this comes as the White House is attempting to forge a normalization deal between Tel Aviv. This comes as the White House is attempting to forge a normalization deal between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. Now, according to Bloomberg, Abu Dhabi and Manama are becoming frustrated with the outcome of the 2020 Abraham Accords. People familiar with the matter said that the leadership in the United Arab Emirates, as well as Bahrain, are particularly concerned over a massacre Israel's apartheid army carried out last month in the northern West Bank. So with the support of the Joe Biden administration, Israeli forces invaded and bombed the Jenin refugee camp, killing 12 people, including 5 children. Israeli bulldozers tore up the camp's roads, electricity, and water networks. 1,000 troops participated in the raid, along with Apache helicopters, drones, and 150 armored vehicles. Moreover, since Netanyahu returned to power last December, Israel has been destabilizing the region. As Middle East Eye reported, already in 2023 has been one of the deadliest years in Palestine. I have to double check what the current tally is, but when I wrote this article, Middle East Eye was reporting that at least 204 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli fire this year, including 36 children, a rate of nearly 1 fatality per day. A total of 167 people have died in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, making 2023 one of the bloodiest years in the occupied territories. And another 36 people were murdered in the Gaza Strip during the bombing campaign against the block camp, which that killed 33 people. Now, another point of contention is Netanyahu's coalition, which is full of extremist settlers and Jewish supremacists and ultranationalists determined to annex the West Bank by force. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said earlier this year that, quote, no such thing as a Palestinian people. The UAE condemned the mass murder in Jenin as well as Smotrich's comments. And so on the domestic front, Abu Dhabi and Manama received public backlash after these incidents because of their relationship with Tel Aviv. And this is interesting because these opinion polls that are cited by Bloomberg are actually conducted by the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy, which is essentially the Israel lobby's foreign policy think tank, set up by Martin Indyk. As a former advisor to Yitzhak Shamir, and then worked extensively with the Bill Clinton administration as an advisor, and then ultimately became the ambassador to Israel. Now, the figures from the think tank show significant drops in support for the Abraham Accords, respectively in the UAE and Bahrain. Only 27% and 20% of respondents saw normalization with Israel, absent an end to the occupation in Palestine, as positive. I have a feeling that's an overstatement. Now, these numbers represent a 20% and 25% decrease in support over the last 3 years. And in Saudi Arabia, when asked if normalization with Tel Aviv would be good for the region, just 20% of respondents said yes, a 50% drop since 2020. Now, the Abraham Accords are a thinly veiled American-led coalition against Iran. It's doubtful the Saudis will want to join, given that Riyadh recently restored full diplomatic relations with Tehran in an unprecedented diplomatic feat brokered by Beijing. The longtime arch rivals resumed full diplomatic relations and plan to expand cooperation, particularly with respect to trade and investment. More on that later. And while both sides have expressed interest even in creating a naval alliance. And so in another move that blindsided, in the words of William Burns, the CIA director, blindsided the U.S., Saudi Arabia has also restored relations with Iran's key ally, Damascus, another country targeted, occupied, and constantly bombed by the Israelis and the Americans. And so officially, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has taken any normalization deal with Israel off the table unless there is a two-state solution and the millions of Palestinian Muslims and Christians suffering under a brutal for now nearly 60 years are given their own state. And Netanyahu's policies of setting records for settlement expansion and construction in these illegal Jewish-only colonies serve solely to eviscerate even the pretense of a future Palestinian state. So Riyadh has reportedly issued demands to the White House, including increased access to advanced U.S. weapons systems and NATO-style security guarantees and assistance building its own civilian nuclear energy program. Although MBS has reasons to be skeptical of any assurances Washington may peddle to secure the agreement. As the Bloomberg article notes, quote, in a continuing sore point, the UAE suspended talks on the purchase of advanced F-35 warplanes from the U.S. in late 2021 after Washington insisted it cancel a contract with China's Huawei for 5G mobile technology. It was promised the weapons when it agreed to establish ties with Israel. The UAE experience over the Abraham Accords has been watched closely by Saudi Arabia. A major aspect of the White House's push for a normalization deal between Riyadh and Tel Aviv is to curtail China's influence in the Middle East. And according to New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, Washington is, of course, also pressuring Tel Aviv to decrease their economic ties with Beijing. And, also the Huawei is another example, because that's one of the things that, one of the things that the Biden administration, according to Friedman, wants is for China to cut its business ties with Huawei and other Chinese tech giants. And so it doesn't look like a good deal, of course, for the Saudis, but there's more and more. I mean, it seems like it's the ultimate goal right now for the White House as far as their Middle East policy, their whole Middle East policy is concerned. It's almost as if that's the top priority, at least it seems currently. And these tensions with Iran and ramping up deployments into the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, and the region in general, all sort of eyeing a future conflict with Iran, seem to be trying to show Saudi Arabia that we really do mean it. We want to provide you a security guarantee. And of course, who knows what the fallout of that is just going to be horrible. I mean, what we should be doing is not even talking about security guarantees, but pledging never to support Saudi Arabia in Yemen on any level if fighting resumes. And that would be all that's all the leverage Biden has. That would be the best thing to ensure a peace deal, to finally lift the blockade and have a settlement. But that is not on the agenda. It's just being used to foster this plan to, for Israel's benefit. And then, of course, we want to curtail and really marginalize as much as possible China and the region. Okay, now speaking of Israel and bombing Syria and their neighbors, this is from Dave DeCamp on August 7th. 4 Syrian soldiers killed by Israeli airstrikes on Damascus. So, Israel, Syrian capital of Damascus, early Monday morning. That was 10 days ago. Now, killing 4 Syrian soldiers and wounding 4 more, Syria's Sanaa News Agency has reported. So they said at around 2:20 a.m. on Monday, the Israeli enemy carried out an aerial act of aggression from the direction, of the occupied Syrian Golan, targeting some sites in Damascus. A Syrian military source told Sanaa. Now, they said our air defenses intercepted the missiles and shot down some of them, and the aggression resulted in the martyrdom of 4 army personnel and the injury of 4 others, in addition to causing some material damages. The attack marks at least the 21st Israeli bombing of Syria this year. Israel rarely acknowledges its individual attacks in Syria, but earlier this year, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doubled airstrikes in Syria since it came to power by the end of December 2022. And Israel frames its attacks on Syria as operations against Iran and Hezbollah's presence in the country, but the bombings are frequently killing or injuring Syrian soldiers and civilians, and bombing civilian infrastructure, although some members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have been killed by Israeli bombings this year, which is a huge potential risk of escalation, especially with the American troop presence. Okay, now this next story, it sounds like there's increasing tensions in Syria. There was a recent attack where close to 24 Syrian soldiers were killed, and Iran's the foreign ministry spokesman pointing the finger at the U.S. Media, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani condemned a Friday Islamic State attack on a Syrian military bus. Other sources claim the target consisted of 2 trucks, which resulted in the deaths of at least 20 government soldiers. Kanani claimed that recent escalations in Islamic State violence are, quote, the result of the continuation of intelligence, security, support for the terrorists that are provided by some countries with the purpose of the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights as putting the death toll at 33, with the Islamic State claiming 40 killed and 10 wounded. The attack took place in Deir ez-Zor province. The Islamic State's avowed caliphate lost control of its last formally claimed territory to a U.S.-backed Kurdish offensive in 2019, but its sleeper cells continue to conduct attacks on both civilian and Syrian military targets, including earlier this year massacres of truffle hunters in the Palmyra area. The group also announced a change in leadership last week, and the new caliph, Abu Hafs al-Hashimi al-Qurashiri, may be attempting to make his mark with an increased tempo of operations. The 4th caliph, Abu al-Hussein al-Husseini al-Qurashi, supposedly died in April when, according to Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he blew himself up during a Turkish raid on his safe house. The Islamic State announced his death in early August and said that he was killed in combat with a Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate. And of course, this attack occurs in eastern Syria near the U.S. Occupied territory there, where we control about a third of Syria, stealing most of their oil and wheat resources. And of course, there's a huge U.S. troop presence there, and if there's going to be increased tensions in that area, and of course you have Israel bombing the country, it's possible that we could see if Syria and Iran do believe that the United States is responsible, it's very possible that there could be attacks by ISIS on American bases that are made to look like it's a Shiite militia, and then you cause more conflict there between those two sides. There's just such a risk of escalation and so many flashpoints in Syria, and it's just we should not be there at all. But this is definitely something. If there's more here, if there's increased Islamic State attacks after this. But, okay.
All right, everybody, that's where we are going to wrap up this week. Connor had a little bit more, but the TED stuff just isn't the best this week. I don't know if it's Skype or the internet on one of our ends. We'll try to clean it up. That way Connor's audio is just a little bit better next week. But we've already got a lot of content out for you, and we'll have more next week. Really appreciate it to everybody who's tuning into the show, sharing out the show, supporting the show in some way, especially those of you who have contributed to the Libertarian Institute fundraiser. If you haven't yet, you can always sign up, just become a recurring monthly donor, or help us out during our fundraisers. Either way, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kyle.